Just this one?
Right,
yeah, right.
He needs to be there to turn you on, doesn't he?
Okay, we ready to go?
Chili.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's coming through this way.
I'm going to go and talk to him and just let him know that I'm starting.
Right. He's coming through the phone, so you're okay.
All right. Hey guys. Okay.
I must have been cross-talking. Yeah, we're good to go.
Could you hear me though when I was talking?
Yeah, but I think Mark was talking about
Oh, all right. Excellent. All right, I'll get started. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of our conference. Welcome to the Centre for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements. My name's Simon Robinson. I'm the project director for cenmva. Yesterday was a fantastic day, and today will be equally as fantastic, I'm certain. I know, Michael. I'm coming to that bit. But first, housekeeping. Toilets are right across. You'll see a sign just there, just in case you need it. Or if they're occupied, there are toilets in the museum building diagonally across the way here. Coming to Michael's speech. So, wonderful keynote today, Michael Ruse, all the way from Florida State University. So we're looking forward to that. I think we'll get started. Michael, why don't you come up and...
Well,
over to you, sir.
okay, thank you. First of all, let me thank the organisers for inviting me. It's a long time since I've been to Bedford, but as it happens, as I was telling your organisers, I have a particularly strong personal family connection with this city. I'm staying at the Swan Hotel, and when I got up yesterday morning and went out the front door, not to have a cigarette, as I used to do, I saw this statue of a soldier. And it turns out it's a memorial to the men in the Bedfordshire Regiment who fought in the Boer War and did not return. And as it happens, my family were all professional soldiers, non-commissioned officers, back to the time of Queen Anne in the 16th Bedfordshire Regiment. And so it's a particularly sort of, what shall I say, almost poignant experience for me to come. Very glad to say that our name is not on the memorial, otherwise I wouldn't be here, I imagine. But it's interesting, we still do have a connection. My great-grandfather was the servant, the batman, of General Redvers Buller, who led the regiment in the Boer War and was one of the most unsuccessful generals in the history of the British Army, and there's competition. But anyhow, dear old Sir Redvers Buller, or I believe it's pronounced Reavers, in fact, gave his name to my father, and now my son has that name. And so we do have a real personal connection going, I don't know, all the way back to Queen Anne with Bedford. So, as I say, for me, it's a particular significance. Now, I spent all of yesterday in an absolute blind panic, thinking, oh my God, what the hell am I doing here? Why is anything... What I'm going to say is obviously important and wise, but is it relevant? And I was having a lot of trouble thinking about this until later in the day I realized, oh my goodness, yes, that what I want to say is tremendously relevant to what we're talking about today. But I want to put it in context. And the context I want to put it in is the fact that some 10, 12 years ago, I published a little book called The Evolution-Creation Struggle, in which I argue that evolutionary theory, or evolutionism, and creationism, kind of evangelical approach to origins, which would include, I think, intelligent design theory, are in fact different sides of the same coin. They're both in the religion, or if you like, secular religion business, trying to give world pictures which go well beyond science. And in this book, I spoke about it in terms of millennial thinking. And as you probably know, there are two kinds, pre-mill and post-mill. Pre-mill thinks that Jesus is going to come, and then comes the millennium. And this is very much endorsed by evangelicals and the creationists and others like that. And the idea basically is not that we do nothing, but that what we do should be preparing for this. In other words, getting ourselves on side with Jesus, going out proselytizing, all of these sorts of things, helping the poor, certainly, all of these things, but with an eye to what is going to happen. Whereas post-mill is very much thinking, no, that we have got to deal with the millennium here, and then will come the second coming. And so, in other words, until I build Jerusalem on these green and present land. In other words, pull your finger out, folks, as the Duke of Edinburgh has said memorially, and get on with the job, and that sort of thing. Now, these are both cast in Christian terms. There are others, amillennialists like St. Augustine, so I'm not saying it's exclusive. But what I did was I argued that the creationists were very much in a pre-mill way of thinking. That basically, this is the world that God has created, and it is our job to get ready for the coming again. As I say, it is not in any sense a message of inaction. My creationist friends, and some of them have labored very long and hard in the vineyard, if I can use such a phrase, to that end. So it's not an excuse for laziness. Whereas I saw evolutionists much more often in a secular, but not always in a secular, but often in a secular post-mill way of thinking, is progress, the world has led up to us, and now let's go on and do it. And all you have to do is read the God Delusion to see the truth of what I'm saying. This is not a scientist writing. This is an Old Testament prophet writing. But it's not an Old Testament prophet writing saying, give up on the world, turn away, or do nothing, or anything like that. It's an Old Testament prophet who's saying, we're really in it, folks. But thanks to who we are, thanks to our reason, God-given or other, it's possible to turn it around and make for a better tomorrow. So this was my message. So what I saw was what I want to talk about on Gaia is tremendously relevant and fits into that schema, as it were, of pre-mill, post-mill, okay? Now, I won't be talking about pre-mill and post-mill now until I come to the end, but keep that in mind as the context in which my talk occurs. Okay, my talk is about the Gaia hypothesis. And this was the brainchild of an English scientist, actually James Lovelock, everybody calls him Jim, Jim Lovelock. And Jim Lovelock is not a theoretical scientist or anything like that. He's an inventor. He's the guy who invented the electron capture detector, which led to our realizing that there was a big hole in the ozone, because he did this sort of thing. One of the interesting things is I want to stress that Jim is very, very good. This is not some guy who, as it were, backs accidentally into things or that sort of thing. But in the early 1970s, he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society. And nobody thought that this was, and it was rather exceptional because he was being made a Fellow of the Royal Society, excuse me, on the grounds of his being an inventor rather than a theoretical or practical scientist. But they recognized, they saw genius when they saw it. So that's Jim. He argued from 1965 on, he had this flash of insight that the world is not just a lump, it is in fact a living organism. I should say he was at that time involved with NASA and going to California quite a bit and working on whether or not there was life on Mars. And of course, all the space people wanted lots of money to send spaceships there. They got very cheesed off when Jim said, oh no, you don't need to go to Mars. All you've got to do is compare atmospheres. And I've got a machine which will let you do that. And as soon as you do that, you see that Mars doesn't have an atmosphere at all like something either which has living things or had living things. But this was the insight for Jim. He said, but now I realize that the Earth is a living thing. Not just living things on the Earth, but the whole thing. And notice that for Jim, it's the Earth versus the universe. It's not the whole universe. In fact, it's the Earth versus the universe. I don't think, to be perfectly frank, Jim is not a philosopher or a historian of ideas. And when I pointed this out to him, he smiled and said, yes, yes, yes. And I think, it didn't make any penetration whatsoever on him. That's not something he's bothered about, if you know what I mean. So this was Jim. Then he was joined about 5 years later. So the Earth as an organism, and this was the vision. Of course, this photo was taken, I think, 68. So it's a little anachronistic. It wasn't that he saw this picture and then suddenly said the Earth is an organism. He was joined by this woman, Lynn Margulis. She was I won't say she was the first wife of Carl Sagan. Let's just say Carl Sagan was her first husband. And she, too, is, or rather was, because she died a few years back, is a genius. And her great move was in the early 70s to argue that the eukaryotic cell, the complex cell, is in fact a fusion of two prokaryotic, two simple cells. And this met with huge, huge opposition. I mean, bullshit was the friendliest term that was used about it. As it happens, since then, particularly using DNA sequencing, she's been proven absolutely and completely right. And she was elected into the National Academy of Sciences on the basis of this. I should say Sagan never got in, but nobody ever denied, again, Lynn's genius. So we got these two genius scientists pushing the idea that the Earth is an organism. Now, what was their basis for doing this? Well, homeostasis. And notice this. For Jim, it's homeostasis that counts. As you're going to see, for Richard Dawkins, the big critic, it's natural selection that counts. And you see fascinating disciplinary boundaries here. An organic chemist thinks in terms of things like homeostasis. An evolutionary biologist thinks in terms of things like natural selection. And sometimes I think you get this happening rather than a fusion working forward. Now, what were their arguments? Well, the main one was the sun has gotten hotter since the Earth began 4.5 billion years ago. And everybody accepts that's a fact. I mean, it's heating up. But the Earth has not gotten hotter. The sea should be a great, as you calculate from the minerals and everything going into the sea should be really like the Dead Sea. But it's not. It's a lot less salty than it should be. And oxygen levels remain stable at about 20%. And so basically the idea that it was Jim's baby, but Lynn was very much behind him. The idea was that all of this points to the Earth being in homeostasis. What's the paradigmatic example of something in homeostasis? A body, an organism. Because, as we know, if it gets hot, you start to sweat, as you did last week, and if it gets cold, this week, you start to shiver, as I did all day yesterday. So this, fascinating, this is from Jim's this is from the first paper they wrote. And it's very clear, you can see exactly the point they're making. Given the temperature, you can calculate what the temperature of the Earth should have been after it was formed. And you can work out, first of all, in fact, because there's no atmosphere or anything, the temperature should have dropped very significantly. And then it should have started to build up as the sun got hotter and hotter. So this is what should have happened. And basically, this is what did happen. as you can calculate from ice ages and things like this. In other words, the Earth is in homeostasis. A nice story. I'm sure that those of you who've, particularly those of you who've published books, are aware that that last moment when you've got to give up the proofs and send them back to the publisher, and the night before you start to panic and you say, oh my God, have I got the main argument I'm criticizing? Have I got, have I got David Livingstone's argument that is the centerpiece of my critical attack? Have I got it quite wrong? And so you dash off to Jay's store or to the library, or in my case, you send a graduate student off, and you find yourself at 10 o'clock at night frenetically reading this in case you got the argument wrong. Well, of course, I did this. I got this paper. And in fact, I hadn't used this picture. I'd used one from Jim Lovelock's later book, which is Nothing Like as Clear. And I looked at this picture, which is very small in the original, rather smudged. And I looked at it and I said, oh my God, yes, now I see why Gaia was so plausible. Now, that sense of empathy, whether you agree with it or not, why was it that a brilliant man suddenly said, the Earth is an organism? And looking at this picture here and seeing what it should have been and what it was, I said, oh my God. I see, but I hadn't used that picture. Of course, it was in copyright to one of these Dutch publishers. So 5 o'clock on a Monday morning, found Michael Ruse phoning Holland. And I'd like to say that by 9 o'clock, I'd paid a great deal of money. And in fact, that's the picture. But that shows so clearly what Gaia is all about, okay? Why it's interesting. Well, it's interesting because you've got brilliant minds pushing it, and there's something there. Now, I should say there was more than something there, because what about the sea salt? Well, Jim's suggestion was that the sea salt, that the salt gets caught in lagoons, it evaporates, and then it gets sucked down underground. And now, that may be true, but Jim said it gets sucked down underground in order to keep the sea normal, because he thought of it as an organism. Why do you sweat? Well, in order to keep the body at a constant temperature. So he was thinking what is known in the trade as teleologically, in terms of final causes, in what will happen rather than what did happen. Well, how did Gaia, the idea, go over with the professional scientific community? This is a picture of a lead balloon. It went over like a lead balloon. I have to tell you. The scourge of the sloppy, Richard Dawkins. Oh, did Richard Dawkins have a wonderful time with this one. Particularly since the SOB was busy publishing a book which was arguing that, things which happen here can affect things which happen in Africa. He was arguing a holistic view of the Earth. But he had to put himself one apart from these terrible, terrible human beings. And this is the point I made. What I find so fascinating is instead of going after homeostasis, as people have done, and saying, well, it's not really homeostasis, or there are aspects which, we question, that never dawned on him. What he said is, there's no reason to think that planet Earth was formed by natural selection, therefore there's no reason to think that planet Earth is an organism. For the analogy of the Earth as an organism, there would have to be a set of rival Gaias. The universe would have to be full of dead planets whose homeostatic regulation system had failed, dotted around with a handful of successful regulated planets, of which the Earth is one. So, a perfectly reasonable argument. But in a sense, at least to a philosopher looking at this debate 25 years later, saying, there's something really interesting here. Because if ever people were talking past each other, this is a classic case of this happening. And of course, then as David knows, the next thing is we're into generalizations. We've got one example, so it must be true for everything. And so immediately we're looking for other examples where it might happen. But what makes the whole debate so interesting is, as Gaia was being rejected vehemently by the scientific community, the general public was picking it up and loving it. And believe me, go on to Google, and you'll see that 3/4 of the economy of California is Gaia-based. I mean, I'm not joking. I mean, there's Gaia gardens, there's Gaia furniture, there's Gaia, Gaia getaways. I'm not telling you, as I say, even there were Gaia sex clubs, but they call them pagans. But that's further down the talk, okay? Don't worry, dear. There's some sex coming, don't worry. Your morning is not wasted. There's going to be all sorts of rude things that are going to have me packing my bag and leaving by 11. Don't worry, dear. And you're going to say, yes, it wasn't proper, was it? But I really did enjoy it. The general public loved it. And my favorite one is this woman, Mary Midgley, who is really is the philosopher's counterpart to Richard Dawkins. She's a philosopher. She was at Oxford before the war, but she ended up at Newcastle. Her husband was professor there, and then she became professor there too. And this is from an article that she wrote about Richard Dawkins. I picked out some of the salient words. Midgley on Dawkins: confusing, weakness, uncritical, unworkable, oversimplified, bankrupt, speculate. It was a 20-page article. This was page 1. So it was natural to find that Mary Midgley loved Gaia, that Mary Midgley embraced Gaia enthusiastically. Like babies, we are tiny, vulnerable, dependent organisms owing our lives to a tremendous whole. And one word I want to pick out here is whole, because I think that this is a key to Gaia, and underlying the difference between Dawkins and Lovelock. I see Gaia as holistic in some sense, whereas I see Dawkins' selfish genes as reductionistic. I see Gaia as organic, as opposed to selfish genes mechanical. Now, please understand, that's not a value judgment, one is better than the other. It's trying to understand why the hell you've got two very intelligent people, Richard Dawkins and Mary Midgley, neither of whom are religious. So we're not looking at one side being ardent Roman Catholic or evangelical or linking Gaia to abortion or anything like that, but at some level so completely and utterly, as it were, not even talking past each other, just incommensurable, to use Kuhn's language. Well, as an evolutionist, I always think that the way to understand things is to turn to the past. It doesn't mean to say we're better than the past, but it does mean that understanding the present, you've got to look at the past and understand what went on in the past. And I think that this is the case here. In a sense, the Gaia story begins, and as Whitehead would say, ends with Plato. The whole of philosophy is footnotes to Plato. Well, the whole of everything is footnotes to Plato. And Plato was the key figure, particularly in his dialogue, the Timaeus, where he did argue that the Earth is an organism. And in fact, as I said, Plato argues that the whole universe is an organism. But as I say, for Jim, that wasn't a matter of any great concern. But the Earth as an organism, the Earth as organic. And I should say that Timaeus was particularly important because it was the only Platonic dialogue known until the Middle Ages. The other dialogues like the Republic and the Phaedo and those which are so familiar to us philosophers were unknown. I mean, they were languishing in libraries somewhere, and people didn't know them. But everybody knew the Timaeus and the whole idea of the Earth as an organism. And this was, incidentally, Plato, you see, argues that you've got the form of the good, and then you've got the demiurge, which creates the earth and everything like that. And then you've got the earth itself with the world soul. For Aristotle, very interestingly, Aristotle, although he was very much into organicism, never accepted a world soul. Because for Aristotle, the unmoved mover, the perfect God, had to be doing that which was perfect. And that meant the unmoved mover had to be thinking about perfection. And the only perfection is itself. So the unmoved mover, like some of my younger relatives, spends its whole life thinking of and only of itself. and could never, therefore, think about this earth of ours, which is incomplete. So it's a funny kind of way that Aristotle... So although Aristotle is very organic, he's not into world souls or things like that. But as I say, you've got these three parts, the form of the good, the demiurge, and the world soul. And so what the Christians did to a great extent was the form of the good is God the Father, the demiurge is God the Son, and the world soul is God the Holy Ghost. And so at a certain level, it was fitted. I don't say that this was, major theology, but people felt very comfortable, particularly people like Augustine, who were very much taken up with Platonism. He didn't get it directly from Plato, he got it from Plotinus, but certainly. So this whole idea of the world soul was in fact a very comfortable part of theology right up through the Middle Ages. And then of course comes the Copernican revolution, and David will point out, well, you've got to be very careful about this. I mean, for instance, Copernicus was a minor cleric, for instance, and certainly died in good standing. So mention was made yesterday of the conflict thesis, Draper's conflict thesis. I'm not into that here today, because it's not true, apart from anything else. But certainly what Copernicus, and then following him, others, and I always find Robert Boyle in many respects more interesting than Descartes, apart from anything else he writes in English. But certainly Robert Boyle, I think, is the great philosopher of the scientific revolution, the one who spotted exactly what is going on. And Boyle said the world is like a clock, and he mentioned the clock which is still in Strasbourg Cathedral. It's one of those clocks where, every hour all sorts of wonderful things happen, like the little clock at Wells, only much more so than that. And so the world is as a machine. And this kind of view pushed the organic view out, in the sense that if you think the world is a machine, then it's not an organism. And thinking in terms of world souls and that sort of thing just basically gets excluded. And this is the way that things go right through Darwin. I see Darwin very much as somebody who's trying to continue the job that people like Copernicus and Newton and others left unfinished. And Immanuel Kant said, there will never be a Newton of the blade of grass. And Darwin basically said, oh yeah, let me show you that there can be, and just so happens I am he. And so I think that's what's going on in The Origin of Species, that Darwin's trying to give a kind of mechanistic view of the world, which goes right down to the selfish gene. And certainly anybody who does anything to do with metaphor or anything, reading the selfish gene is just a wonderful experience to see the kinds of ways in which metaphors are driving the discussion. People think of metaphors as things you add to the content to make it clearer. Well, of course, those who've studied metaphor seriously know it doesn't work quite that way, and that metaphors drive the discussion. I mean, natural selection, for goodness. But certainly, as Dawkins speaks so nicely of organisms as survival machines. And so, as I say, I see this mechanistic view. So it seems that worlds as organisms has gone, but of course it hadn't. There's always a second side. There's always a second side. You see, the point is the machine metaphor did not, in fact, show that the organic metaphor was false. It was much more pragmatic. The machine metaphor said we can turn out the sorts of things we want for science, like predictions, much better than the organic metaphor. So go with us. I mean, that was the big debate between the Cartesians and the Newtonians over action at a distance. The Cartesians said, action at a distance, this is Aristotelian, this is organic, this is not mechanistic. And what the what the Newtonians said is, oh, well, we're changing the frame of reference, but we can afford to do that because if you adopt our position, you get predictions that you folks can't get. And if you're going to build machines and ships and and armaments and those sorts of things, you need a science which works predictively, and ours works. So, as I say, I don't think this is a simple Popperian case of falsifiability or something like that. It's much more an argument, as it were. So, as I say, why didn't people then like the Gaia hypothesis? It wasn't called that then. Well, it's teleological. It thinks of it's working in order to stay in balance. It's doing things now so that tomorrow will be okay. If it doesn't do it now, then tomorrow we're doomed, sort of thing. It ignores natural selection, and it's holistic. And as I say, I see the trend of modern science, and particularly Darwinian science, as being completely in the other direction. I mean, and selfish genes is not necessarily the best piece of mechanistic science, but it's the apotheosis of mechanistic science, in the one that lays its motivations most bare, if you like. So, okay, then, as I say, it's not so much a question of Gaia being false, but it's just out of tune with modern, very successful science. And yet, all along, this idea of the world as an organism, it was called hylozoism, after Ralph Cudworth in the 17th century. You probably notice I have trouble over words. So, as I say, what you see then is this idea of the world as an organism. It persists. It's not the majority position, but it's always, I'm writing a book on war at the moment. The basic Christian position is the Augustinian position. War isn't evil, but sometimes we must fight. It's obligatory on Christians sometimes to take up arms. That's the basic position, the basic Augustinian position. But there's always been the minority position that Jesus said in the Beatitudes, turn the other cheek. You must never do this. And so while you've had your Lutherans and Presbyterians and Anglicans and others and Catholics prepared to go to war, you've always had your Mennonites and your Quakers and your JWs and others who refuse. So as I say, it's although the dominant position is this, there's always been, I would like to say, a healthy alternative position. And I think the same is true here. Mechanism has always been the dominant, since the time of the scientific revolution. Mechanism, reductionism has always been the dominant position. But that there's always been this healthy, and I would call it healthy, alternative position as the world as an organism. Most interestingly, you often get the same position in the same person. Kepler is rightly, one of the great heroes of the scientific revolution, one of the great heroes of taking us away from the Aristotelian world picture into the picture of the world as a machine, with the work that he did on planetary motions. And yet, at a personal philosophical level, he was always committed absolutely and completely to an organic view of the world, and particularly the Earth as an organism. And this wonderful passage, as the body it displays tears, mucus, and earwax, so also in places lymph from the pustules on the face, so the Earth displays amber and bitumen. As the bladder pours out urine, so the mountains pour out rivers. And this is the good one. As the body produces excrement of sulfurous odor and farts which can even be set on fire, so he goes on to say we get volcanoes. I once knew an engineer who actually did light his farts. I told you it was going to get more interesting as we went along. I would like to say on record that I have never, ever met a philosopher who's lit a fart. Now, okay, that's a personal view, but I have to say we do some really quite naughty things when nobody's looking. You know, we say, I can't stand Wittgenstein and that sort of thing. Never say it in front of that chap, but lighting farts is what you might say a match too far as we're concerned. But apparently Kepler knew all about it. So this is the point I'm making. I know I'm being humorous and a little bit rude, but the point I'm making is that this idea of the Earth as a real organism, not just some sort of ethereal idea, was something which was right there in the scientific revolution and which continued right through. The place where you get it most is in German Romanticism, around the beginning of the 19th century. And I think the person you get it most in is Friedrich Schelling, the philosopher, who, incidentally, at the age of 16, wrote a 60-page essay on the Timaeus. At the age of 16, I mean, this is Mozart behavior. You know? I mean, people at 16 don't write 60-page essays on the Timaeus. But notice what he wrote on, because by then they knew the whole Platonic corpus, but it was the Timaeus, the organic view, And he had this idea of the world as an organism. And if there's one key figure in my Gaia story, after Plato, it would be Schelling, in the sense. Now, let me say, I don't think that Jim Lovelock has ever heard of Friedrich Schelling. But we know all about that. We know how that sort of thing works, that scientists can be unbelievably ahistorical in that sense. And we look at their work and say, oh my God, and they say, who? Because that's the way science works. You forget your past and get on with the present and that sort of thing. Now, one person, now this is interesting. How many of you know about the Rudolf Steiner movement? Yeah, I thought I'd find that. And the Waldorf schools and that sort of thing, yeah. Rudolf Steiner turns out to have a key role in my story. I should say my stepmother, after my mother died, I was brought up as a Quaker. My father married a German woman whose family are into Steiner. In fact, her father knew Dr. Steiner. And my father worked at a Waldorf school for many years. So my attitude about Steiner is I know all about it. I think it's absolutely total nonsense, but that, and there are things I disagree with very strongly, like the vaccination issue. But the point is, I knew about Steiner, and oh my God, I did not expect to find that Steiner would play a part in my story, but I think he plays a very fundamental part. And Steiner, who lived at the beginning of the 20th century. He was Austrian, but worked most of his life in Germany and worked in the Goethe Institute, or worked on the Goethe papers and that sort of thing. He was very much influenced by Madame Blavatsky, Theosophy, but then he developed his own kind of quasi-Christian view. And Steiner, who then founded the Waldorf school system at the request of one of his rich supporters, and also was very much into agriculture, particularly after the First World War, and developed this system of so-called biodynamic agriculture, which is a little bit like organic agriculture, but with some fancy sorts of things, like things you do at midnight when the moon is full and that sort of thing, and all of these sorts of things. So, and it's still very much, particularly in places like America, it's still very much a thriving business, but it's very much a minority thing. But as I say, Steiner, particularly if you look at the writings that he has after the war on agriculture, makes it very clear that he's completely into an organismic view of the earth as an organism. He thinks, in fact, the organs are turned inside rather than outside, but certainly it's the earth as an organism. And you see, once you've got the earth as an organism, then you've got ideas like, well, then things go wrong, affect the body politic, and what you've got to do is be concerned about the health of the earth. And that, of course, flags you to things like artificial fertilizers, and particularly to DDT. And in fact, that was something that the Steiner people picked up on even in the 40s. That DDT is not a good thing. And they were writing very strongly about it. Now, of course, okay, so that's Steiner. I'll pick up on Steiner again in about 2 minutes. What I want to say, though, is that the big place where Schelling had his effect was in America, particularly through the New England transcendentalists, who were looking. You see, what you've got with the world soul is that the idea of God, not as God as an individual, the chap that you meet in the garden in the cool of the day, and that God is a person, the God that Alvin Plantinga worships. In other words, the God particularly of the Protestants. What they're looking for is much more God as world soul. Almost, not necessarily even a conscious world soul, but God as a life force. And this, of course, is very much what you get in Emerson. And if you read any of Emily Dickinson's poetry, you'll see that this is the underlying philosophy. So Schelling, with his world souls, was picked up. And this is Peirce writing about Schelling, about Emerson. I was born and reared in Concord, in New England, at the time when Emerson and friends were disseminating ideas they caught from Schelling, and Schelling from Plotinus, who, of course, was the Neoplatonists, in other words, from Plato. So you get this idea of the earth as an organism. It's a part of American culture. It's part of American culture. And it goes right through to people like Thoreau, if you read Thoreau, and particularly in the 20th century, the great figure in 20th century environmentalism, Aldo Leopold. And if you look at Leopold's writing, philosophy suggests there's one reason why we cannot destroy the earth with moral impunity. The dead earth is an organism possessing a kind and degree of life which we intuitively respect as such. So this is part of American psyche at a certain sort of level. And then, of course, we come to Rachel Carson, the great Rachel Carson of the 1950s, who writes the definitive work against environmental pollution, who writes so powerfully against the use of DDT and that sort of thing, who was at the same time also a very skilled science writer. She didn't come out of nowhere. She came out of the 1930s, and she'd been writing science at a more popular level since the 1940s. A classic case of sexism. She couldn't get a proper academic post, so they said, well, why don't you write the reports of the Institute for us, that sort of thing. And so she started doing this, and she turned out that she was very, very talented at doing that. And so she'd already written books before Silent Spring came out. Now, Silent Spring is very carefully organized or put forward. She knew she was going to have a huge amount of opposition, particularly from very powerful chemical companies. So the last thing she could do was let on that she might have had any flaky sources. If they caught Rudolf Steiner, they would be pre-tweeting Trump on this, They would be saying Rachel Carson has a bleeding face, which I gather was yesterday's, yesterday's Trump tweet, Poor little Rachel Carson, got no real brain and her face is still bleeding from it. She had breast cancer, knowing Trump, and her chest is still bleeding. I mean, I tell you, if you see what he did yesterday. So she knew she could not mention Rudolf Steiner. However, she got all her stuff about DDT from a woman called Marjorie Spock. And I'm sure in England you know Benjamin Spock, the pediatrician. She was the younger sister of Benjamin Spock, the pediatrician. And she was an ardent follower of Rudolf Steiner. She went to Dornach in the 1920s, studied. She was a eurythmy teacher, the dance that they do. But also she was one of what we now obviously see was a kind of subculture of lesbian intellectuals, if you like. These were people who often had money, but who were certainly involved in doing things, not just sitting on their bums, but were concerned about things, but passing information around. And it's clear that Marjorie Spock and Rachel Carson struck up a relationship like this. And the letters are still there. And Rachel Carson said, "You are my chief clipping service." And we know that Marjorie Spock fed all of this Steiner, not Steiner-based, but Steiner influence to get on and do this kind of work. And she fed it all to Rachel Carson. So what I'm saying is Silent Spring, believe it or not, I think the biggest influence on Silent Spring is Rudolf Steiner, although you would never see it there at any point. Then, of course, but the idea, particularly in the 60s, you get ecofeminism and green ecology, and all of these. So Arne Næss, for instance, the Norwegian, deep ecology, I suspect our thinking need not proceed from the notion of living being to that of the world. We will conceive reality or the world we live in as alive in some sense, not easily. There will then be no non-living beings to care for. So what I'm saying is this idea of the Earth as an organism has always had a very healthy existence. And just going back to Rachel Carson, she makes very clear in some of her writings, and even in Silent Spring, that that's the perspective she's coming from, to see the Earth organically in some sort of way. We are killing Mother Earth. And, of course, inevitably, it got caught up by the pagans. I actually went out and interviewed these people. I'm glad to say I did not have to go skyclad. They did invite me to take my clothes off. They said, we can have a much more comfortable discussion if we take their clothes off. And I said, I'm a philosopher. I'm not into lighting farts or taking my clothes off in front of pagans. But anyhow, So I went out to California to interview these people. And again, the pagans are completely and utterly into Gaia. And in fact, they got in touch with Jim when it came out. And this is the picture. I wanted to put this on my cover, but University of Chicago Press said absolutely no way. But it's the picture of Mother Earth, the Earth as an organism, as I say, something deeply. Now, here is my second Steiner link, and this is particularly interesting, and this takes me back to Jim Lovelock. Jim Lovelock, as I say, was an inventor. He was not a regular scientist. And he only very occasionally actually had university appointments. Most of the time, he worked for the government, and then he went independent. And what he would do is, people like Pi and other electronic people would have him on contract. And every 3 months, they would get their engineers together with Jim. And they'd say, well, we've got some problems here, Jim. Cast your eye over these if you've got any thoughts. And it was worth enough money to them to give Jim Lovelock £5,000 a year to have him ready to do that. I mean, that's the kind of quality work that he was able to do. So, I mean, that's what makes it very interesting. So by the 1960s, Jim then is no longer at the institute where he'd worked. He's doing some contract work in America for NASA, so he goes over to California, a couple of months every year, that sort of thing. But by and large, he's living, I think, in Wiltshire in a little village. And the only other person of, let's say, his social class, that sounds a lot more snobby than I mean to. The only other person that he'd meet in the pub in the evening would be this novelist, William Golding. Now, of course, by this time, Golding had shot to fame by Lord of the Flies, but of course he'd been writing other novels, including The Inheritors and then Pincher Martin. This Pincher Martin is a very strange novel. It's about a man shipwrecked on a rock in the Atlantic, and he spends the next week dying, and memories coming up. And he's not a very nice man. At the end of the week, presumably he dies, and then in the final chapter, we learn that he'd been dead all along. That in fact he died, as it were, his body was washed up. And so what's going on? Well, what is going on? And of course, nobody sees this, is the Rudolf Steiner idea of the doppelganger. Steiner believed that we have a doppelganger, and that when we die, over the next short while, the doppelganger also has to die, and that dies away. But the doppelganger has all our bad side. And so this has to die away so that we, as a soul, and of course, Steiner believes in reincarnation. I mean, you want to think a nutty, square it, double it, and you're getting close to anthroposophy. But so he believes that we've got this, that the soul is going to go on and transmigrate. So he gets all of this, you see, from Madame Blavatsky and that sort of stuff. He's got this. But it cannot go on in the state that it is at the moment because it's tainted. And so the doppelganger, as it were, separates off and dies. And so what Golding is doing is working out the idea or using the framework of the doppelganger in his novel. And as soon as you realize this, the whole novel makes sense. And the fact that this man who's dying is not a very nice man, you say, somebody can't be this awful. Well, of course, the individual was not this awful, but it's this side of him that's awful, that is dying away. And soon you see, well, of course, none of this is mentioned. But in fact, that's what's going on. We know that Golding was very much taken up in the 1930s with anthroposophy. And he was very close to some of the leading anthroposophists and those who became priests and those sort of things. Now, in the 40s, he gave up strict belief in anthroposophy, but to the end of his life, he always said, I owe a great deal to anthroposophy, and I think in many respects I respect their idea of the spiritual side to life. And in particular, it's clear that when Jim Lovelock was getting this idea in the 1960s, the only person he was talking to about Gaia was his drinking mate in the pub, who, of course, was very empathetic to this idea. And so we see this going. Now, I asked Jim Lovelock about this, and of course, Jim being Jim said, oh, no connection at all. But then I discovered that, in fact, there was a connection. Jim Lovelock actually sent one of his kids, a handicapped kid, to a Steiner school. And there's letters where it's clear that Lovelock and his then wife, his first wife, had dug into the Steiner philosophy and looked into it. And Jim knew a lot more about anthroposophy than he was letting on to me or to the world generally. If you look at his autobiography, there's nothing about this. Nothing. Any more than in John Carey's book about William Golding, which was published about 5 or 6 years ago. Carey recognizes that Golding had something to do with anthroposophy, just as people know that Rachel Carson knew Marjorie Spark, who was an anthroposopher. But because anthroposophy is so nutty, these people who write about their heroes cannot possibly imagine that their heroes took anything from it. And of course, you know, we as historians of science know that if you think of a dark motive, it's almost certainly true. So anyhow, I don't think of this as a dark motive, but I do think that Jim Lovelock's view of Gaia, certainly whether he got it from Steiner, but I certainly think his reinforced in his confidence about it was certainly something that, he says this, came lots of nights chattering in the pub. And this is from Golding's Nobel Prize winning lecture, given about 1980, maybe just a little bit early. And he said, "We have been caught up to see our Earth, our mother Gaia Martyr, set in a jewel in space. No excuse now for supposing her riches inexhaustible." Notice, you know, we're starting to worry. So, yeah, nobody's saying that the Earth can go on. It may be in homeostasis now, but, you know, if we continue what we're doing, we could be in big problems. So, or the area we live on, limitless because unbound. We are children. Our mother is part of the solar system. In the blazing poetry of fact, we are children of the stars. But notice, folks, we've got obligations because we live on Mother Earth. Because we live on Mother Earth, that's where our obligations come from. So why did the general public like it? Well, obviously, because Hylozoism, American tradition, and then in the 1960s, 1970s, a lot of New Age stuff going on, the pagans and all of that sort of thing, and I'm certainly prepared to buy into that and all of that. Why did the scientists hate it? Now, this is an important part of what I want in my story, because it was a pseudoscience, they said. But so, big deal. So it's a bit pseudoscience. And I have discovered that scientists start to get nasty about pseudosciences when they're insecure themselves. When they're insecure themselves, this is when it happens. It came about in the following way. Little anecdote. I'm at the Florida State University. I went there in 2000, and there was talk of founding a medical school. Well, by and large, the campus was not keen on that because, as we know, medical schools drain the resources from everywhere else. Nevertheless, we went ahead in 2003, started a medical school, and yes, it has drained a lot of resources. But the medical school realized that they were not popular. So what did they do? They paraded the fact that their primary mission is to teach general practitioners who will work in rural areas. Now, how can a good liberal like myself object to an institution that's going to turn out GPs to work with poor people? You know? So it was fine. And then a rich legislator, who was a chiropractor, gave FSU Medical School $10 million to found a department of chiropractic. The administration loved it. They even got to the point of advertising for a dean in the Chronicle of Higher Education. The medical school, and I'm afraid I'm going to use another technical term now, went apeshit. They absolutely died. If we found chiropractic, we're a small, insecure school, a department of chiropractic, the whole of American medical establishment will laugh at us. You know, we can't have it. And immediately the cry of pseudoscience went up. I went back and looked at the newspapers. Now, the thing is, I knew already that certainly in Tallahassee, where I live, the doctors and the chiropractors get on very well together. And if you go to the doctor and you say, "Doc, I've got this really bad back pain," the first thing they're going to say is, "Well, why don't you go and see a chiropractor?" You know, they're probably going to be able to give you some exercises and some help on that. Don't listen to them if they're going to cure cancer, but at least at that level. And by and large, the chiropractics know that they shouldn't suggest curing cancer on the first visit anyhow. So they get on really well. And yet up went the cry. Why? Because the medical people... You see, if they'd been Harvard could start a department of chiropractic, and if everybody else complained, they'd just say, "Well, up yours, you know, we're Harvard, it doesn't matter. If we do it, it's right." You know, but, FSU couldn't do that. And so up went the cry. And this flagged me. Why are the scientists talking, why are they reacting so strongly against Gaia? And of course the answer is because the scientists themselves, as John Maynard Smith, the leading English evolutionist, said to Jim Lovelock, he said, we've got all sorts of fights going on about creationism. Those of you who know evolutionary biology, about punctuated equilibrium, the big debate about classification, about cladeism. Sociobiology and Ed Wilson. There was one fight after another in evolutionary biology and that area, ecology, in the 1970s. Along comes Jim Lovelock, all happy, here I am, walking along, simple soul, Earth is an organism. They just about died, and they turned on him for that reason. And in fact, this is Maynard Smith said, look, Jim, the trouble with Gaia is we've had such agony with vitalism and group selection, all those other things. We thought it all worked out. And then you came along. You couldn't have chosen a worse moment. Now, the reason why, and I'm coming to the end of my story, the reason why I'm telling you all of this is, again, I want to emphasize, we're not dealing with Popperian science, falsifiable, true or false, or something like that. We're dealing, I would say, with religious movements, but at least with cultural movements, where we're negotiating, and all of those sorts of things are going on. And the point I want to make is not that Gaia is right. I mean, by and large, I don't think the Earth is an organism. And then I spent 3 months in South Africa, in Stellenbosch, in the wine growing area. It's the most beautiful place in the world. And I thought to myself, if somebody, mining company, came along and said, we're going to take off the top of one of these mountains for minerals or for coal, the first word I would use would be rape. The first word I would use is, don't rape this environment. And notice, rape is, you rape human beings, you rape organisms. And so, yeah, understanding, yes, at some level it's a metaphor, but I don't want to say it's a bad metaphor or a silly metaphor or that people got it from Rudolf Steiner makes it a bad thing or anything like that. Even Margaret Thatcher sometimes said things which are right. But so understand then what I'm trying to say. I see this as negotiation so much. So this then takes me back to the whole question of pre-mill and post-mill. Who were the people who, other than the scientists, who really did not like Gaia? The evangelical Christians. And I've got them on record as saying it. They said, oh yeah, we see all sorts of points about environmentalism, but basically the Earth is a creation of God. The Earth exists and gets its value from God. Gaia gives the Earth an independent value existence. Gaia gives the Earth a religious, ontological, theological status in its own right. And we think that that is heresy. A statement made at the height of the Gaia controversy by the head of biology at Wheaton College. That's the evangelical college in the Midwest that Billy Graham went to. So that, in other words, the evangelicals found Gaia, as I say, I see this because they've got this, you see, I want to suggest that Gaia is something that lends itself very much to a post-mill perspective. We're in trouble. I mean, we saw that in Golding. We're in trouble, folks, but don't despair. It's not too late. We can do something. We can do something. Now, whether we think of doing it through our God-given abilities or not, the point is, folks, we're in big trouble. Get on and do. And I see that as very much a post-mill sort of perspective. So I want to put Gaia, as I don't in the book, but I would now, I want to put Gaia very much in perspective of this book that I wrote. And I should add, as a final footnote, halfway through writing this book, I discovered that somebody in this room who shall remain nameless, but who lives in Northern Ireland and has the name of a famous explorer, it turned out the son of a bitch had already written an article on this very thing that I had to kind of pretend I didn't know about and write apologetically and say, well, David, I'm just filling in. Of course, I'm not saying it was David Livingstone, you understand. So, yeah. Actually, I look at him, he looks more and more like Plato to me every day. So there you are, all footnotes to Plato. So there you are. That's why, in fact, I think that what I am talking about in Gaia does have relevance to what we're talking about here, because I see it very much as something which fits very comfortably and revealingly in an apocalyptic framework, particularly apocalyptic framework of thinking in terms of premillennial, postmillennial. And what that means, if you take those in as tropes at some level, as not necessarily tied explicitly to religious people, but to a religious perspective. There's one of, there's nothing we can do, folks. Well, the end is going to come. We're in the hands of God. What we must do is prepare for that, as opposed to, we're in big trouble, folks, but we've got the abilities to make it better ourselves. Roll up your sleeves and get on with it. And so, as I say, I see the Gaia hypothesis as absolutely fundamental to this conference. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Michael. If you have a question, put your hand up and wait till I get to you with the microphone, please. Questions for Michael? Richard, and I'll come back to you.
Hi. With regards to Lovelock and whether he's pre-mill or post-mill, I'm wondering, obviously what you've said certainly applies to the way that he frames the Gaia thesis in his
I'm
books.
not threatening you, I hear better if I listen to you.
But what, I mean, in terms of his more recent pronouncements on, both fatalistic pronouncements about climate change and also his recent comments on the impact of AI, I mean, would you see there being a shift in his tone from the works that you're referring to towards something which is more pre-millenarian, or would you still see it as consistent with the post-mill?
Perhaps. Do you know, I never quite trust Jim. He says what goes well, and then after you've talked to him for about 20 minutes, half an hour, he starts to sound like 1965 all over again. And I spent 2-3 hours talking to him, and we agreed that it was a metaphor and that. And then his final comment was, Mike, the Earth is an organism, and he smiled. So yes, I would see him adding these things on. I would be very hesitant in the case of Lovelock, and this is not at all to put him down. I'd revere the man. But he's not a philosopher, he's not an intellectual historian. And so to a certain extent, he's liable to pick up the flavor of the day and run with it a bit. And then, it's not completely well thought out always. So my feeling is perhaps so, but I think fundamentally it's the earlier Jim Lovelock that's basic at some sort of level. But, as I say, there's a good paper there.
There's another question at the front.
The title of your talk is the Gaia hypothesis really such a silly idea?
Yes.
And I guess one of the reasons why it's been accused of being a silly idea is the whole concept of personification and anthropomorphism in it, which obviously you've demolished quite well during the course of the talk. But in the context of the dialogue or argument between creationism and evolutionism, isn't a point being missed that one of the guiding principles of evolutionism is that that which survives is that which fits in, and within the concept of Earth as an organism, obviously the survival mechanism is the fitting in. And therefore, there is no real conflict between the concept of evolutionism and the Gaia hypothesis. Well, I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Of course, a lot of the question is where you're talking about fitting in, isn't it? I mean, personally, I would want to say I look upon the Earth as an organism as a metaphor. So the whole point about metaphors is that they're not literally true. So if I say that this woman over here is a red, red rose, I don't in fact think she's a vegetable. But, what am I doing? I'm drawing certain aspects to her, her beauty, maybe I'm making reference to the fact that she's rather prickly, like roses are. So, but the point is, I don't think she's literally a vegetable, any more than Well, maybe you could put us right on this one, Simon. But as I said, this is the reason why he wants me out of this place by 11 o'clock sharp. Not au revoir, goodbye. But no, seriously, you're absolutely right. I mean, I see no tension in my being a completely committed Darwinian, and at the same time saying, I think the idea of the Earth as an organism is a metaphor to which I'm very sympathetic. There are times when I'm not sure that it's that useful, but that I am very, I mean, after going to South Africa and thinking what my reactions on seeing those hills being destroyed, I said that I clearly at some level am committed to Mother Earth. I mean, I hope I am. So as I say, I don't see any great tension. Of course, the question is, what do you mean by fitting in? I mean, I think Dawkins is right. There's no reason to think that the Earth is an organism in the way that, we are in that sort of way. Yes, David.
Michael, thank you for a fairly typical performance, I have to say.
I'm not sure that that's intended as praise.
My question is about the dark side of metaphors. Now, you've toyed with two metaphors this morning, mechanistic and organic metaphors, both very fertile. You can do fabulous predictions on a mechanistic model, and indeed you get an interesting ethic out of an organic model, not least for environmental concerns. But both of these have a dark side. For example, if you treat people as just machines, you may not be treating them in the best way. Or, for example, if you lived in Nazi Germany and thought the state was an organism, it could very easily lead to a notion of Lebensraum or something of that sort, which could be used for pretty dark purposes. So do we have a responsibility to think about the dark side of the metaphors that we're using, not least metaphors in connection with climate change and apocalypse?
Yes, I think that's an incredibly important question. Please, David, don't tell me you've already written on it, because I've got a book halfway done on the subject. My God. But you're absolutely right. And the point that David is drawing our attention to is in the 20th century, nobody was more into organic thinking than the National Socialists. I mean, we know that their interest in purity in food, for instance, and things like that, anti-smoking, all of these. But certainly the state as an organism is an incredibly powerful metaphor. And if you look at a lot of the Nazi anti-Semitic cartoons, what they've got is the picture of Germany as an organism and the Jews as rats or diseases which are affecting the organism. So the answer to your point that you're making, I think, is tremendously important, that the organic metaphor has to be treated with care. And those who say at some level, oh, well, because it's organic, it must be good, which we're all into to a certain extent, that's a very dangerous argument, because the point is, because it's organic, you could say it must be bad. And, so I do think that that's a very important side to it. Having said that, of course, well, it's like everything, isn't it? And you as a Christian would say there are very few things which don't have their dark side and their light side. There are very few things. I mean, the whole point about being a Christian or being a human being is so often look, we're here in the land of John Bunyan. We're faced with these choices. And do we take the easy path? Or do we take the straight and narrow? And so often I think that life is this question. I think the organic metaphor is one which raises this very acutely.
Hi, thank you for that talk. Fascinating. I wonder if the concept of Gaia, and to my knowledge, I don't think Jim ever said that, from the start that the Earth is an organism. He certainly said it behaves as if it were one. The important thing is the aspects of feedback mechanisms, and that it gives you a good justification for doing one thing in one place that affects somewhere else and provides an increase in albedo or burial of carbon, and that affects the whole system, whereas previously it was very much, well, what's happening in this place? I mean, even today, impact assessments are based on a particular place rather than considering where they fit in the wider landscape, region or globe. I'd like you to comment on that.
Yes, well, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, the other side to David's thing is that there's there's two sides to organic, is there's two sides to mechanism or organism. And the simple fact of the matter is, mechanists, reductionists, have to recognize systems. They have to recognize that systems are integrated. And of course, as I say, the farce is, at the very time that Dawkins is criticizing Lovelock, he's busy writing this book, The Extended Phenotype, where he's arguing that things which happen in Bedford could then go on and have effects on things that happen down in Bulawayo or something like that. So he's dealing with integrated systems. And if somebody, as I would say, looked at it and said, oh my God, Richard, this is just what Jim Lovelock's talking about. This is Gaia. Of course he'd say, no, it's not, because I'm not looking at it that way. And that's true. I mean, I don't, but at the same time, you have to recognize that there are fundamental problems to be grappled with. You see, this goes back to what I was saying originally. I don't see the triumph of mechanism over organicism as being a simple question of truth prevailing over falsity, light over dark, Popperian sort of science. You know what I mean when I say Popperian science. It's false, it's been falsified sort of thing. I see so much of science, particularly in these big questions of negotiation, that's a good word, I guess, where, for a long time, organicism just wasn't very useful for the kind of work that people were doing. Now, of course, you get back to things like quantum entanglement, and my God, if you don't have something holistic, I mean, we're told you can do something to a molecule or an electron here, and, right across the universe, something, now, if that isn't holistic at some sort of level, I don't know what is. Now, I don't mean that, therefore, you should say, oh, let's go back to Plato and do... No, maybe you can keep doing the sort of work you're doing. But the point is, we're wrestling with the same problems. It's a question of which way do you want to look at it. And of course, novelists think of this. They say, yeah, that's a good metaphor for what I'm trying to do. But maybe another metaphor would just sort of edge out some of the issues which this metaphor doesn't quite deal with, and that I want to focus on. Rather like I was doing this morning. Well, I can talk about Gaia, but then I said, I want to put it in context to sort of ease out some questions that I don't quite deal with there that I'm pointing to.
Wonderful. It's time to take a break now. Thank you very much, Michael Ruse. Yeah. We'll meet back here in 20 minutes, please. Is this work? Here we go. I just wanted to let people know that there's an exhibition in Castleside, which is the museum over here. It's on the top floor. It's Precious Earth Ceramics exhibition. Mandy, do you want to talk a little bit about it? Just 2 minutes.
Hi, I'm Mandy. I'm a tutor. I work at Raleigh House in Bedford, if anybody knows it. It's been there for many years. About 5 weeks ago, I rang Gemma saying, could we have some space for an exhibition about climate change? And she said, oh, that's strange. We've got a conference coming up at the end of June on climate change. I said, there's no way they'll be able to make work in ceramics and have it fired for the conference. Go on, and let's go for it. So my students, who are all mature students, have worked like crazy to make work in time to coincide with this conference. They're going to be touring around the country, and it's going to grow. It's going to be a very organic exhibition. So it'd be really helpful if anybody would like to go and look at the work. In the classroom, it's been really inspiring because people that haven't been interested in climate change and world issues before have been spending a lot of time researching to get ideas for their work. And there's a great dialogue going on in the classroom. I run 5 classes over the week. And so many people are becoming interested now in this touring exhibition. So it'd be really helpful, I thought, if people could go and have a look at the work. There's a comment book up there, and you could make some encouraging comments to them. These are people that have never done an exhibition before. And whereas 3 weeks ago they were saying our work wouldn't be good enough for an exhibition, now they're saying, why hasn't there been more publicity? So it would be, and we did have an article in the paper last week, and they changed my title to Art's Going to Save the World or something. I'll put it out there on the table. But it would be really useful if you could give some helpful comments about ideas for their next project, which is in October at the John Bunyan, and they're going to be leapfrogging all over the place. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
And back to schedule now, so pleasure to introduce Ryan Bird.
All right. All right. As Simon said, my name is Ryan Bird. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Oklahoma, and this paper is based upon the research I conducted for a capstone project that I was doing during my last year of undergraduate studies. So I want to begin by describing the nature of my work in geohumanities, sound, and the idea of attunement that's going to be the focus of this paper. Geohumanities has been described by my mentor, Dr. Nick Bauk, as the intersection of geography and the creative arts, which emphasizes interdisciplinary radical production geared towards generating new forms and methods of knowledge. This leads to different understandings of the world and its phenomena, such as climate change. Sound, as a medium and method of communication, is ambiguous. Often, we do not immediately understand basic information about the sounds we perceive, such as their content and context. But within this confusion and ambiguity lies potential. The voice that creates sound might represent a phenomenon that we as human beings do not typically encounter or consider. In recognizing and adjusting to hear or otherwise perceive these voices, we attune to them. There are 4 main notions of attunement. The first derives from Kant and his use of the musical term Stimmung, typically translated into English as harmony. Think of it like the romantic idea of experiencing beauty or the Kantian sublime. The second notion of attunement was developed by Heidegger and relates to a preconscious affect, a tuning of being where we as humans calibrate ourselves to hear and experience in certain ways and ruin these affects when we become aware of them. The third notion posits attunement as a process similar to empathy. It's an embodied mechanism through which we track emotion. The fourth idea of attunement is the one I focus on in this presentation. Recall that the term Stimmung is the origins of the first Kantian notion of attunement based on harmonious beauty. The translation of Stimmung into the English word harmony erases definitions of the term which relate to orienting oneself to dissonance or tension present in sound. This violence in translation that obscures this definition is one of the characteristics of geopolitical sound, according to Anna Kanizer. By this understanding, attuning to sound opens up potentials of understanding that are in tension with the lived human experience. Phenomena such as climate and climate change occupy a spatio-temporal area that is hard to imagine in human terms. This is due to factors such as climate affecting the entire geospatial area of Earth in large and small detail, and it's occurring on a timescale that humans are not used to considering. Thus, to properly conceive of climate change requires a more than human perspective. But to get from our human perspective towards this more than human one requires a mechanism to mediate this difference, such as sound. For the rest of this paper, I explore attunement, apocalypse, and climate change within 3 songs, including their relationship to depicting climate change as an apocalypse. The first song I've examined is Idiotic by Radiohead from their 2000 album Kid A. Before I play a segment of the song for reference, I want to state that Idiotic is quite experimental. Dadaist composition techniques were employed to disrupt storytelling arcs, and climate change as a subject is addressed only implicitly, not directly. And on a technical note, due to copyright restrictions, I can only play this and other segments to the live audience. Sorry for streamers. With that in mind, here is a segment of Idiotic. Within that segment and the rest of the song, we get a sense of apocalyptic climate change as overwhelming. Tom sings elsewhere, "I have seen too much," euphemizing death and other hysteria with the lines, "I'll laugh until my head comes off, I'll swallow until I burst." There's also a lyric question earlier of who's in the bunker? In that question, another line, "Women and children first," is a sense of urgent evacuation for safety. Whatever this climatic threat is coming soon, and we need to prepare. As you heard in the instrumentation and the singing of frontman Tom York, there is also a large amount of tension and anxiety produced in Idiotic. One source is technology. The electronic instruments played by the band do it in an abstract sense. And also the line, "mobiles squirking, mobiles chirping," heard in that segment reflects the idea that noise and distraction produced by cell phones and other devices might stop us from acting. Corporate influences are also a huge source of concern, with Naomi Klein's book, No Logo, a major thematic influence on Radiohead while creating Kid A. The line, "take the money and run," that you heard reflects this sentiment of corporate entities causing climate change and then shirking responsibility for its effects. These attempts to cover up and spread denial of climate change in debates appears in the line, "let me hear both sides," which suggests an exploitation of media fairness norms to create a false impression regarding the consensus about anthropogenic causes of climate change. These lyrics and sounds reveal an inequality of agency among actors, one geopolitical notion of sound. The anxiety and complexity surrounding climate change feeds into the fear Radiohead has that we will not adequately address the issue. This most clearly occurs in the projected lyric, "We're not scaremongering, this is really happening." And while it is certainly possible that destructive policies and consumption habits can be stopped, reversed, or otherwise altered, but distractions, vested interests, and a general disinterest work against addressing a fairly complicated and abstract phenomenon like climate change. And so these geopolitical inequalities hinder agency and capacity. A climate change apocalypse is coming, and though we can't stop it, Radiohead fears we won't. 16 years later, and after far more change and development than I could describe at this moment, both musically and environmentally, Radiohead released the song The Numbers as part of their album Moonshaped Pool. Like Idiotic, climate change is not directly referenced in The Numbers. Frontman Tom York debuted the song during a solo benefit concert for 350.org during the talks that led to the Paris Climate Accords, however, which suggests that The Numbers is about climate change. And so, like with Idiotic, here is a segment which gets at this, if I can get the mouse to work on that. The Numbers' opening lyrics, it holds us like a phantom, it touches like a breeze, it shines its understanding, reference climate change and this process of attunement. Assuming it to be climate change, these lines address the difficulties of properly perceiving climate change that is understood through vague and discomforting dissonant mechanisms. The next lines, open on all channels, ready to receive, reflect such a need for attunement and a flexible capacity to perceive the truth of climate change by peculiar means. These perceptive capacities are reinforced elsewhere in the Numbers, lyrics including, we're not at the mercy of your chimeras and spells, and the future is inside us, it's not somewhere else, demonstrate not only a perceptual capacity relating to climate change, but a capacity for agency to combat climate change. This is a near complete reversal from the climate change present in Idiotic. While climate change might still be an overwhelming and anxiety-inducing phenomenon, it is also actionable. The issue of directness in discussing climate change also carries over from Idiotic into the Numbers. Tom York sings, we call upon the people have this power, the numbers don't decide, your system is a lie. And later on, also not heard in what I played, we'll take back what is ours, one day at a time. These lines lead closer to political speech than singing or storytelling, but the Numbers is less call to arms and reassurance that victory will come. The quieted confidence of the instrumentation reflects this. This idea of action is reflected in Kanyesir's proposition of imperceptibility. To quote her, there is a need for slower, more careful, reflective, and different kinds of activism to deal with gradual and less visible processes. Climate change is one of these processes, and the Numbers reveals this idea through sound. Also within the lyrics of the Numbers is an idea of commons and common interests. Tom York, the frontman, sings of a collective, indeterminate we in conflict with the you opposed to our interests. Kanyesir writes that the idea of sound as a commons reveals, quote unquote, the world is not for humans, the world is rather with humans, a relation that is not without antagonism. Tom York sings, we are of the earth, to her we do return, underscoring the tension in this multidimensional conflict, and I believe touching on the idea of Gaia that came up in the keynote speech before me. Finally, the imagery of the Numbers as lyrics is interesting not for what it contains, but what it doesn't contain. Unlike Idiotic, there is not anything within the Numbers that suggests climate change as apocalyptic. While it might remain somewhat unknowable in the Numbers, it is perceptible and actionable. Apocalypse is rejected in favor of recognizing agency and empowering others to act to prevent an apocalypse from occurring. While Radiohead's changing understanding on climate change provides a different and welcome perspective from earlier narratives, theirs is not the only one. Although Radiohead have abandoned apocalypse and direct action in their work, they remain useful constructs. My final song, 4 Degrees by Anony, from her 2016 album Hopelessness, presents a quite different picture of climate change. Anony explicitly wrote that 4 Degrees is a first-person attempt at self-criticism for not being accountable enough for her role in causing climate change. The title refers to the estimated average temperature rise predicted to occur this century, driving 1/6 of the Earth's species to extinction. Here is a segment of 4 Degrees that gets at that. Four Degrees portrays climate change as a violent, fiery apocalypse. Oceans boil, animals burn to death, and at the most dramatic point in the song, Anony bellows, I want to burn the sky, I want to burn the breeze. This directness is a massive change, as you can tell from Radiohead's vagaries. 4 Degrees also examines the world through a human-focused lens. The instrumentation simulates a string orchestra, yet maintains a synthetic edge, and similarly, the mid-range singing of Anony sounds somewhat unnatural for a variety of reasons. These two elements remind us that the natural environment is truly human-managed. The song also references dogs, fish, rhinos, and lemurs dying from climate change. As charismatic megafauna, As charismatic megafauna, these species elicit stronger affective responses from humans than other organisms. Anony uses the first person not to place herself as a witness to this violence, but to close any distance and recognize her role as perpetrator. 4 Degrees begins with the lyrics, "I want to see the world, I want to see it boil," and ends, "I want to burn them." This violence occurs remarkably easily. "It's Only 4 Degrees" is more than just a title by which we frame the song. It's repeated within there 20 times. This frequency diminishes and familiarizes the line within the listener, making the process go from a large abstract impossibility to a small, easily accomplishable one. Annie is asking, if this will happen, why wait? This desire for apocalypse, death, and destruction is unsettling as someone who considers herself an environmental activist like Anony. Why sing about your subject in a manner antithetical to your worldview? It's because these lyrics are meant to be interpreted in a sense like a Trojan horse and provoke the opposite action within its listeners. If you're not going to take preventing climate change seriously, this argument goes, you might as well light animals on fire. But who wants that? This dissonant yet coherent message on climate change within 4 Degrees helps us recognize the otherwise imperceptible through ideas of interspecies inequality, commons, and futures within geopolitical sound. Now, Anony's 4 Degrees and Radiohead's The Numbers have been compared a lot to one another, not only because they were released within a month of each other, first as their premiere and then on their respective albums. The 2 songs examine similar phenomena from drastically different perspectives, and understanding these differences helps us better understand the music itself and the environmental politics contained within them. Within the popular music sphere that Radiohead and Anony occupy, music is received subjectively better if it's considered authentic. An artist in their work is authentic in this understanding if it is serious, aware of its role within the late capitalist music landscape, and positioned such that it resists the artistic or ethical compromises known as selling out. But the idea of selling out in music is not limited to subjective judgment of the music itself. It includes the artist's operation in the wider music economy. Radiohead toured Kid A by staging concerts in blank canvas tents, somewhat similar to the one we're in right now, to avoid corporate-sponsored music venues. Earlier this year, however, in promoting A Moon-Shaped Pool, the album The Numbers comes from, Radiohead headlined Coachella. It's a massive music festival in California. And this proved to be controversial as Coachella's corporate CEO has financed conservative political groups which advance climate change denial agendas. And while this does not mean that Radiohead has necessarily given up on fighting climate change and being political actors in this sense, it does signal resignation or exhaustion with direct action, as some music critics noted within The Numbers and the music of A Moon-Shaped Pool more generally. Anony responded differently to ethical dilemmas facing her work in this manner. She came to regret accepting money from Apple to produce a music video for the Apple Music platform, stating that she was bought as a politically spoken artist to further enable Apple's disrupting of the music economy. But this supposed greater authenticity of Anony is not the full picture of this debate. In defending Radiohead's actions, the writer Marvin Lin argued that Radiohead's working within the music industry with a greater complicity or other hypocrisy allows them nonetheless to communicate their beliefs more widely, such as by promoting the work of Naomi Klein. I should note that this argument was published within 2010 and covering Radiohead's actions in the early 2000s, yet remains relevant to this day. This contrast also mirrors broader, long-standing debates within environmentalism about whether the movements should institutionalize themselves and work from within different structures or remain outsiders to these established systems. Applying this debate to Radiohead and Anony, we see a split that is not just about politics, but further relates to the artists' identities. In an interview, Radiohead frontman Tom York explicitly stated he cannot write good music directly about climate change in the form of a protest song. The resulting indirectness that we get in songs like The Numbers isn't necessarily bad, however. It seeds the grounds of direct action to other persons and identities, and Anony, a transgender female artist I should note, benefits from this indirectness. The greater precarity of Anony's lived existence means she probably has not had the luxury of critical distance from politics, which resultingly would impact her own thoughts and speech. As one anonymous music critic argued, the inversion present within 4 degrees also inverts the logic of identity politics, the personal is political type thoughts, which means that Anony, as a result, discusses climate change in direct and personal terms. This is not unwelcome. In another review of Anony's music published in The Quietus, there's this quote that I like in there. There's been plenty of time for bearded boys to pontificate over world events in broad brush reifications, and perhaps it offers the listener very little in the way of agency. With hopelessness, the messages are clear and direct, even when they present something with an ambiguous flourish, and the question rapidly becomes what is to be done in the face of them. This diversity in perspective and experience embodied in sound related to climate change offers different pathways to understanding and action, and certainly this tension ought to be productive rather than destructive. To conclude, music and other phenomena of sound enable the development of awareness and understanding of objects and events such as a changing climate. By recognizing and orienting the sound's embodied dissonance and tension. Because attunement relates individuals to larger phenomena in a transitory experience, communicating through an ambiguous medium like sound, it is subjective and might be difficult to realize. Text such as song lyrics and other information content needs to supplement or otherwise guide these explorations. The discussed songs of Radiohead and Anony demonstrate that themes of climate change and apocalypse utilize attunement in a variety of messaging formats. Though my paper explored the performance of listening to studio versions of songs, other songs or genres of music also offer potentials for attunement. And other experiences sound, such as installation pieces, concerts, or non-musical sound, could do similar work. The limits to these approaches must be recognized. Immediately after Tom York, the frontman of Radiohead, said he cannot write directly about climate change, he remarked, "It's not like one song or one piece of art or one book is going to change someone's mind." Indeed, if only it were that simple. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Mm-hmm. Questions for Ryan? Tristan.
Great paper, Ryan.
Thank you.
I just had a question about Anony, who, was it your interpretation, or did you listen to an interview with Anony about that song? Because I think one other way, and the only reason I ask this is because another way to interpret it is since around 2000, 2005, there's been a number of radical scholars who have actually advocated a climate apocalypse. To kind of bring in a socialist revolution through the back door of a climate apocalypse where capitalism won't be able to abide, right, or won't be able to continue on when things get to 4 degrees, and potentially for some radical scholars this could be perceived as a welcomed event. Is it possible she's interpreting that or reading through that literature? I mean, even Naomi Klein has edged close to that kind of logic, hasn't she?
Well, I'm not terribly familiar itself with Naomi Klein's work, even though I probably should be for as much as I'm a fan of Radiohead. But to get back to your point, she did conduct an interview with a fan forum, which said that basically she was inverting the tropes and relying sort of on invoking the apocalypse to try to spur action to fight it. She's done other work in promoting it and criticizing other groups to work on it. So she's obviously being sincere in her songs, but the message is still inverted. It's not meant, I don't think, to want to bring about the apocalypse. It's to want to prevent it.
Okay, thank you.
Katerina, and then I'll come to you, Ariel.
Thank you. I think that was an excellent paper, and I sort of will discuss somewhat similar issues from literature, and I know virtually nothing about music, so this was really very insightful, I thought. Is there anything you can say about the reception? I mean, that's sort of a literature question. I mean, how either critics, but also sort of the general audience, how do you know anything about how they respond to these messages? I mean, does it translate into action or more awareness? I know this is kind of a different, kind of a fuzzy question, but I'm just wondering whether you have any information about that.
Well, in creating the presentation that I did, it was part of a wider research project. So that didn't involve going into databases looking at critics' reviews, something like 20 for each artist or so. And it was generally these reviews consist of albums, and they were received positively in the sense that I guess more like they like the music. I think it's harder to exactly gauge the impact that the activism the artists have done within their music and other venues. I'm thinking of different protests Anony and frontman Tom York have done. That wasn't what I had focused on so much as analyzing the music itself. But I do think in communicating with a large-scale audience like Radiohead and Anony often do when you're playing concert venues and stuff like that, that's quite important for mass mobilization and sort of keeping up morale and encouraging others to act.
Thank you. It was a fascinating, thought-provoking paper. So, historians type question then. Radiohead's last album to me would be late Radiohead. So, is there anything in earlier Radiohead, Ben's OK Computer, where you can see similar concerns? Is there an evolution? The serious question is there an evolution of ideas? Is this stuff present in the early material? Is it only present in the later material? And you mentioned Naomi Klein. Is there source material that's influencing them that's then coming through the music?
Well, I think it's natural for artists like Radiohead and stuff. Like you do see in the evolution of sound, like OK Computer doesn't sound the same as a moon-shaped pool and all of that.
But are the same environmental concerns present in these earlier works, or is it a later development?
I think it's a development that really came through in creating Kid A. I haven't exactly thoroughly examined the entire back catalog of Radiohead, so I can't exactly say if there are environmental messages on Pablo Honey or the Bends or anything like that. But you really see sort of the break in Radiohead in OK Computer, where you start seeing the political activism along a number of different fronts that have gone primarily from OK Computer to, I guess, I want to say Hail to the Thief, which was hugely critical of President George Bush. And I think those concerns have receded. In the interview I've mentioned of Tom York, he sort of disavowed that he considered himself an activist and stuff. So I think there is a change, and I'm not necessarily sure if it's good or bad.
And are you able to explain what the trigger is between the Bends and OK Computer?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Are you able to explain why there is a shift, why there is that transition?
I think the shift in terms of that, when you look at it, Radiohead was given a lot of more artistic freedom to create a new product with OK Computer due to the success that they had had in the Bends and that. So they sort of used it to leverage it into the more experimental work that they had been going off of. I can't entirely say if the activism itself also emerged out of this period or if it's a longer one, because that's simply not something I have really examined.
We have time for one more very quick question. Anybody? Okay, thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you.
Pleasure now to introduce Graham Harvey from the Open University. Graham.
Thank you very much. First, I just want to say thank you to the organisers for inviting me and apologise for not being here yesterday. We had exam boards on, much less exciting, perhaps apocalyptic for some of our students. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really would like to have been involved in some of the longer discussions. So I want to take a shift to think about contemporary Indigenous peoples and the way that they are experiencing, engaging, responding to, confronting climate change in various places. My research has been among a variety of Indigenous people. And I will talk a little bit about that towards the end if I don't keep rambling. But I want to introduce a number of other people's work, a couple of Indigenous scholars and the way that they're thinking about the contemporary situations that they and their people are in. So my abstract begins by saying the world has already ended, and that's the flavour of the talk. So here are some historical illustrations from North America. This is not a metaphor, the world has already ended. The world for 90% of the population of Mexico pre the conquest ended. 90% of Mexican indigenous peoples were dead within a very few years of the first white person turning up, European turning up in Mexico. The deliberate slaughter of bison on the high plains is not only an act of ecocide, but also an act of genocide. And given that the human populations of the high plains understood themselves to be part of a larger than human community, the destruction of the buffalo herds, bison herds, was for them the end of the world. Everything they did was living with bison and other creatures. The other picture there on the bottom right corner is the smallpox blankets, deliberately introduced. So I was trying to find an image of North America. If you were to draw a map of the first European arriving, the disease line is 100 miles ahead of that. As the white folk crossed America, the disease line was 100 miles ahead of them already. So genocide, the end of the world, ecocide are not metaphors. The end of the world continues to happen. The Pacific sea level is rising so that there are now, sorry I've said this, I don't know if I've got the exact figures, but many of the people of oceanic islands now live elsewhere than their homelands. The people of Kiribati, the Kiribati peoples, are migrating because Kiribati is disappearing. Many of the other oceanic islands will be gone in a few short years. And in the intervening period, the effects of climate change and severe weather effects is massively disrupting life for everybody, human and other than human, on those planets, on those islands. Maybe they are planets. So, so that's the unpleasant backdrop, the apocalypse in the sense of disaster already affecting people at the front line. So this is the first of the two Indigenous scholars I want to say just a little bit about. First is Larry Gross, an Anishinaabe scholar whose book Anishinaabe Ways of Knowing and Being introduces and discusses the post-traumatic stress that his and other Indigenous people are struggling with, and to some degree the resources in their cultures, surviving cultures, experimenting, developing cultures, that deals with the survival of the genocide, of the ecocide, the massive, well, the end, I was going to say disruption, but the end of their cultures in many ways. But their refusal to take it as an end, their insistence that there are resources that they will deal with. So that the Anishinaabe culture, in brief, one of the resources available to people there is seeing the world as a larger than human community. So there's a couple of pictures there of the sugar maple, the maple syrup trees that in spring the people go out still to tap to gather maple syrup, and the child is there so I can tell you that, as Larry Gross explains, the children are told to be quiet in the forest because it's their home, and we are quiet in other people's homes. Now, nobody stops the kids from making noise. The second and third year they're told the same thing, and eventually they begin to get the idea of this is how you behave in somebody else's home, the home of the larger than human community. So the kids are still introduced to ways of being in the world which treat the world as an animistic, larger than human community. Somebody earlier said something about getting rid of personification. This is a nonsense. We can only talk about personification because we white-bearded male humans think that white-bearded males are the only really important beings in the planet, and we talk about other beings in that way because we're personifying. This is nonsense. We talk about other beings as persons because they also act in family groups with desires, with passions, with fear, and so on and so on. That's what it means to be a person. It doesn't, white skin, bearded maleness is nothing to do with it. So, sorry, it was not in my script. So just drop the nonsense of personification. We're talking about persons in a larger than human world. So Larry Gross, I recommend to you saying some very exciting things about the resources of Anishinaabe and other Indigenous and other than Indigenous communities. So dealing with post-traumatic stress as a culture, not purely as individuals, finding in the culture resources for behaving in the world in different ways to those that are normally encouraged by the dominant European-derived culture. Then I want to say a little bit about Kyle White, who is a Potawatomi scholar of climate change, of environmental science. And so Kyle White's contribution to this apocalypse debate is to say, we've already been through climate change. The Potawatomi were marched out of the forests of the US-Canadian border south to Oklahoma to an arid zone. They arrived shortly after the Cherokee and other eastern nations who'd been marched out of the eastern forests to the arid zones of Oklahoma, dying en route in massive numbers. I mean, the people who were marched were the survivors, the 10% of their people who'd survived the disease spread and the previous genocides. Those 10% and the recovering community were then marched to these arid zones. So they've been through climate change in a very literal, non-metaphorical sense, from forests, from wetlands, from agricultural and hunting communities, to a place where they knew very few, if any, of the plants and animals that then had to survive among, and with the aid of, the literal aid of giving up life to feed the humans who got there. So Kyle White's work is not only as an observer of global climate change and an historian of previous climate changes, but also somebody who goes to engage with tribal communities, indigenous communities across North America and beyond, helping those communities to find the resources for dealing with the current version of the end of the world, of apocalyptic climate change, trying to find ways in which those communities might deal with it, not by being backward-looking, imagining a romantic era of harmony with the earth, but of people dealing vitally now with a multi-species community. So that's Kyle White's work, and Kyle White is very present in the internet. Lots of exciting stuff that you can find, both solid science footnoted papers, but also his more interventionist blogging about ways of dealing with wild ricing and so on and so on. Okay, so I could talk about Kyle White a lot more. Okay, so there's I'm now going to go backwards a bit. These are not just people talking among their own communities. For example, the Choctaw Nation provided food during the Irish potato famine. When the English were still taking wheat out of Ireland, the Choctaw were sending food to Ireland so that people would eat. Of course, it wasn't enough, so more Irish people left. So there's a memorial in Middleton, and just this year there were communities, the Choctaw sent people to celebrate with people of Ireland, ways of engaging with that, and that's a pagan. So if we want to keep some nice themes and threads running through, the lady who isn't the Indigenous woman, she's the woman in black is an Indigenous Irish pagan. Not taking her clothes off at this point. Sorry, just challenging all the cliches here. Okay, and again, this is not about romanticism necessarily. I mean, nothing wrong with a bit of romanticism. Isidoro Lopez was assassinated earlier this year because he was at the forefront of dealing with the Tarahumara community in Mexico and their attempt to stop the destructive exploitation, extraction industries, destroying their forests and so on. So he's just one of the recent, I mean, only one of this year's people assassinated. So if you've been following, I think Greenpeace and Survival and so on are foregrounding what's happening in Brazil at this moment. So the Brazilian indigenous communities are also at the forefront of challenging some of the things that are carrying on these destructive, genocidal, ecocidal, apocalyptic events. Okay, so just briefly, because I have no idea how long I've been talking. Right, thanks. My own research, I've had the privilege recently of hanging out at an Indigenous festival in Arctic Norway, Sápmi, a Sami organised annual festival in midsummer. So you can go next month, or is it, yes, July, still next month. In Arctic Norway, there's this amazing festival that brings together performers from around the planet, mostly around the Arctic and subarctic, but elsewhere too. It's in a fantastic valley, which in Norwegian is called Mandalen, next to Hagdale, so the man and the Hagdale together. I'm afraid I can't remember the Sami name, I apologise. That valley is formed by a couple of rivers. Now, the reason I put this up is not just to talk about the amazing things that happen in that festival. I could talk a lot more about that, but the river there is higher than it should be. This is a picture I took a couple of years ago. The river was almost overflowing the site of the festival. And it was overflowing because it was hot in the Arctic. That water had been ice probably 10 or 15 minutes before the picture you see there, the top of the mountains. The water was melting so quickly and the water was flowing through the mountain into the fjord. Now, climate change. I was having a conversation with a guy as I was looking at this water, worrying about how cold it was, wishing I could get into it. And he pointed out to me that the salmon and the trout were in the field waiting to come upriver to spawn, but they couldn't, not only because the water was too cold, but also because the water flow was too much for them. And he said, this is a terrible disaster for the fish. And it wasn't primarily about the fishing, the resource that the Sami local coastal Sami people relied on. It was about the larger than human community being devastated by something clearly caused by humans. So that's the apocalypse in both the senses of disaster, of evolving climate change, but also apocalypse in terms of sense of the revelation of resources that Indigenous people are bringing to this debate. Because they're on the front line, they're desperately impacted and affected, but they're also trying to say different things about the possible human responses and ways of engaging with this with climate change. This is one of those field pictures. I put it up purely so you've got something to look at whilst asking interesting and challenging questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. And we must talk later and sort of stories.
Sorry?
We must talk later about, yeah. Questions? Justin?
Thank you, Graham. That's absolutely fascinating. And I suppose a question that sprung to my mind is, you talked about the resources that Indigenous peoples have, and I really appreciated the fact that you talked very concretely about the fact that they were living often post-apocalyptic world, that they'd experienced their world being destroyed. But I know it wasn't what you were talking about, but I wonder, from your experience, how, given the apocalypses that they had experienced were ones generated as a result of human agency, that these other people came and caused this mayhem to their world. Do they have a kind of a sort, or have you seen patterns in perhaps explanations of what had happened? Do they just put this down to people coming and not understanding the way the world really is? So these people didn't have a grasp of this larger than human world that we live in? Or is there a mythologizing of the apocalyptic experience for them? Or?
Yes.
I know asking you to generalise about all sorts of cultures, but anything.
So I've heard a variety of explanations of what happened, and to me, one of the more consistent narratives is that Europeans had also been an indigenous, or a variety of indigenous communities that also lived within larger than human communities. And the only reason they could do the colonisation, the settler colonialism and so on, was because we'd first of all crushed our own indigeneity. So that provided a foundation for forgetting that we came from a place, and we left our ancestors behind and forgot them, and we forgot the plants that we lived off and among and so on. And we went off to collect others. So those stories, I mean, better told than that. And I've heard those kind of stories elsewhere. There are plenty of versions of the Europeans as the younger children, or the question of whether we're really human in the first place. So there's a classic anthropologist. Sorry, let's go back. When European people went to the Americas, there's a consistent Catholic attempt to find out whether the people in those places were human, and they did that by finding out if they had souls. Did they believe in something like a god? I mean, obviously there's a missionary effort there, but if they could believe in something like a deity, they were obviously more human than animal. So that was important, this interior life. There were some interesting other experiments by the indigenous people to find out if white people were human. The issue is not have they got a soul, but okay, you look like us except for the funny coloured skin, but are you some sort of weird, dangerous cannibal spirit? And you test that by putting them underwater and keeping them there for a while and seeing if they change into the dangerous, nasty spirit. So this is a Puerto Rican indigenous attempt to find out if Europeans were really human, with somewhat unpleasant effects on both sides, of course. And there are plenty of other stories about the cannibalism. If you read the Jesuit relations narratives and the conquest of New England and Eastern Canada, they consistently kind of reveal that the indigenous peoples there are worried about these cannibal people who are basically greedy, taking, not sharing. And that's quite a common narrative too, that the cultures of the local indigenous cultures were about sharing, to the point that sometimes if you were a hunter, you were not allowed to eat the animal that you'd hunted. You would share it. White people had none of this decent etiquette. So those are kind of stories that I think illustrate, perhaps not, I mean, yeah, the ontology of humanity and white humanity.
Justin and then Katerina. Then Ryan.
Thank you very much. Your starting point that we're already living, the apocalypse has already happened, we're living in a post-apocalyptic scenario. That's interesting. It's something I would say as well, that the apocalypse is uneven, but specifically it's geographical.
Sure.
I think it's about geography, isn't it? Certain cultures experience apocalypses. Daniel Boyarin, the famous Jewish scholar of the Holocaust, for example, says that Jews already lived through the apocalypse. We're living in a post-apocalyptic scenario. But I was also thinking, I remember reading Bill Cronin's Changes in the Land. I don't know if you've read this book. And part of that, he says, well, a lot of the Aboriginals in North America, specifically in modern eastern United States, would have created their own undoing had they had the technological tools to do so, and they would have been responsible for all sorts of extinctions. And I remember reading a Nature paper a few years ago that said 2 of the largest cities in the world happened to be, I think one was in New Mexico and one was somewhere else around there, and that these societies had basically collapsed in a kind of Jared Diamond sense. They had overused the resources around them and then had their own apocalypses in a sense. And so this isn't to pull away from the 100 million people that died in Teotihuacan in Mexico and things like this, but in some ways, and no way an apologist for the European colonists either, but there are these different apocalypses that happen throughout history, some of which are done on their own.
Yes.
And so I think sometimes that romanticism, and I know you said you weren't being romantic about it, about some Aboriginal cultures within North America, I think is sometimes misguided.
Sure,
Yeah.
no, you're right. I mean, and that's part of that challenge to romanticism is to insist that these are not people living close to the earth by some inherent natural, unthought through thing. The Yucatan Peninsula is the classic example of the overexploitation of resources, that there's been a recovery because of the collapse of human populations. Those cities are still being revealed in Yucatan. And many of these other peoples, yes, there are examples of massive exploitation, but nothing like the overexploitation consequent to Columbus being found on a Caribbean beach. That was meant to be a joke. Columbus got discovered on a Caribbean beach. So yeah, no, I mean, we need those stories, and we need to understand that there is perhaps something not only human but larger than human too. If somebody didn't tend this garden, it would very quickly probably become a birch forest, because birch trees are very good at exploiting any piece of land that they can get hold of. And they almost any species in the world wants the world to be more suitable for themselves alone. And one of the things that happens in Indigenous narratives and rituals is the insistence that not only humans are responsible for the way that we engage respectfully, but all creatures are. So if you want a really good piece of writing about environmentalism, ecofeminism was mentioned earlier, Val Plumwood's article, Being Prey, just go and read it. Crocodiles too are responsible for the way that the world works as a multi-species community. Val Plumwood knew that because she was attacked by a crocodile for being in the wrong place. It's a great article. We are not the top of the food chain. Crocodiles like to eat us, but they also police bad behaviour by other species. It's a great piece of writing. Val Plumwood, Being Prey.
Thank you. This was a great talk. I was wondering whether you can say a little bit more about, and obviously you mentioned a number of different people and culture and individuals also, how they see them, as I said on specific examples, in relationship to the rest of the world. Because I'm sure, I mean, the Sami that you mentioned, or the North American indigenous scholars, I mean, they, of course, they know that they live in a world where their position is obviously sort of specific history of victimization, but also the majority will not change this worldview. I'm sure they're absolutely aware of this. Could you talk a little bit about some responses that they have and engaging with the majority culture? I'm sure they don't want to continue to see themselves as victims also. No. How does agency come in here?
Good, very good. So yes, so in part that's what happens at Ridu is very much, I mean, so again, you know, it should be obvious, if so far unstated, that these are people living in exactly the same world as us. They fly to the Arctic, they drive their cars, they do science, and so on and so on. They're not people trying to live as their ancestors lived absolutely, they're trying to draw on ancestral tradition, as somebody recently said, is a fire you tend, not a bunch of ashes that you venerate. Yeah, good metaphor. So Ridu Ridu is one of those examples. I slipped and used the word survivance, which is another Anishinaabe scholar's complicated word for not just surviving, but trying to thrive and trying to say we are going to live well in this world. So Ridu Ridu is about celebrating Indigenous being in the world, and so trying to say, look, we're not going to get through this apocalypse, this disaster, just by being miserable about it. We've got to celebrate. So let's learn how to talk to the world. So in fact, that picture is of the strand where Niels Aslak, a Yoik chanter, used to live. So a Yoik is a chant. It could be sung from one human to another. It's a gift from one person to another. But those persons could be the mountains or the field, the reindeer or the salmon, and so on. So Yoik is a thing that many as Sami are trying to recover traditions about and to adapt into the contemporary world. They become parts of Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish and Russian song traditions as well now, in which they want to encourage people to speak to the larger than human world, to try and have a conversation and to listen. You know, hugging trees and talking to trees is easy. The difficult bit is the listening. Yeah, so that's the bit that I think that they actually want us to learn is, never mind talking to trees, when are you going to learn to listen? And there are these kind of interesting resources that are there. So I think there are lots of these kind of indigenous and trans-indigenous where lots of indigenous communities come together. So another short bit, because I know somebody else has got the microphone. Ridu one year, a Maori singer, Moana, and her band Moana and the Tribe, they began their set by saying, from our mountains to your mountains, from our rivers to your rivers. And that wasn't simply a geographical scenery recognition. This was about saying the mountains don't move that much, but humans who belong to the mountain and the river can bring greetings from that large in the human community. And maybe the whole audience, non-Maori audience at this point, is encouraged to sort of learn something and to try and see, is there some part of that we can adapt without being totally appropriative? Sorry, so that's a brief answer.
All right. I am someone who went to school in Oklahoma. I'm not originally from the area, and I'm not going to claim to speak on behalf of Native American groups in Oklahoma. But from my own experience, oftentimes I see Native Americans sort of frame what you consider to be apocalypse more of a process of continuing traumas. You have events like the Dakota Access Pipeline protesting and other things, where it's engaged on a much more human level in terms of political goals instead of more than human ones. Do you think you can speak about this for a little bit?
I can, but I suspect that that's partly dependent on the audience that they're addressing. Given that the pipeline people were talking about being water protectors, and if the media thought that meant we're protecting water so we can drink it, they've only got a very small part of the story. They were protecting the water so that the water could flow, because rivers deserve to flow from the mountain to the sea, and so the salmon can live in there, even if we don't eat them, even if they're creatures that we don't want to eat. So the narrative for people talking among themselves is often more than the narrative of the political thing. But these are very wise and savvy people who are going to say, okay, if this gets us the story, if we have to put on feathers to get on television, we'll do that. If we have to say this is about climate change, it's about protecting water so that it will flow to the next white town downstream, we'll do that. But what's happening in Ottawa today, in Canada 150, and so on, is not only about humans celebrating humanity, but that isn't to deny. I mean, sorry, I wasn't trying to undermine that, because of course humans protecting other humans is also important, because humans are not separate from that larger than human community. Humans are part of that multi-species world, and when we do disappear, the world will have to adjust, and the apocalypse will affect other species. So that narrative that we sometimes hear of, it'd be, that humans are a disease and it can be eradicated. That's not a typical narrative of most indigenous people, and not even white people being a disease. We're all part of this community, and we've got to find better ways of living. Sorry, am I preaching now? Shouldn't be. Sorry.
Thank you, Graham. Some fascinating material in your presentation. Just a couple of remarks prompted really by the conversation you were having earlier with Justin when you said the word cannibals.
Yeah.
And you're welcome to respond. Perhaps a little bit more nuance about European attitudes to contact with indigenous peoples in the Americas might be welcomed in the early modern period, that there isn't a uniform response. So, for example, there is mass condemnation of Spanish atrocities in the New World by Bartolomé de las Casas.
Yes.
That's used by Protestants as propaganda against the Inquisition.
Yeah.
And particularly in your use of the word cannibals, if you want to respond. If you don't yet know it, my students love this text. Michel de Montaigne's essay on the cannibals, the first Western European to introduce the concept of cultural relativism. And it's something I urge you all to read as a way of thinking. So not all Europeans have a particularly triumphalist approach. Some are condemnatory, some are ambiguous, some are ambivalent, and that perhaps might be something that we want to think about as well, would be my point.
Yeah. No, in a 20-minute presentation, it's easy to skate over things and to come and to do the romantic stuff that I also want to challenge. So yes, I mean the European narrative practice and so on was not consistent in any way. You use the word slavery practiced by the British was not the same as slavery practiced by the Spanish, and so on and so on. These are all very different things, and the shorthand words we use can mask those massive differences. So, I mean, other than say, yes, I agree, and we need to hear those things more, I could launch into other stories, but I think probably... I mean, so thank you for the challenge, and you're right. There are those things. Nonetheless, the majority experience was that the European voices contesting whether it's slavery or the plantations were the minority voices, and they very rarely did much more than save a few people from the full horror. So, yeah.
Graham Harvey.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. We're going to break for lunch now. Let's meet back at 1 o'clock. Everybody, sandwiches in the tent next to us. Everybody welcome.